and welcome to this webinar presenting the 2021 edition of the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. My name is Lars Christiansen, and I'm a Senior Project Officer here at UNEP DTU Partnership, which is a collaborating center of UNEP based at the Technical University of Denmark and is coordinating the production of the report in close collaboration with UNEP. The webinar will take around 90 minutes, starting with presentations of the report's main findings by some of the lead authors, and following those presentations we will have a short panel discussion, and finally we will have an open Q&A session where you, the audience, can interact with your questions and comments. Please note that participants can only interact in writing. You should see a small question mark in your interface, and this is where you can type in your questions for the Q&A session, as well as any practical and technical questions you may have to the webinar itself. I will be back shortly with some further introduction, but for now I will just like to inform all of you that we comply with the General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR, and this means that your personal data such as name, email, workplace, etc. is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuing to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. For access to the data or further information, please contact the people listed in this slide. And with that out of the way, I would like to now give the floor to Niklas Hagelberg, who is coordinator of UNEP's subprogram on climate change, for some brief welcoming remarks. Please go ahead, Niklas.
Thank you, Lars. And it's good to see the numbers are still climbing up, but good to have all of you at this webinar for the 6th edition of the Adaptation Gap Report. The Adaptation Gap Report is a little bit of a younger report compared to the Mission Gap Report, and it's also a little bit more difficult report to produce as we don't have a clear global goal and indicators on adaptation. But yet the Adaptation Gap Report has managed to kind of carve out a clear role in the negotiations and also to inform the adaptation community. That all said, we are still heading for 2.5 to 2.6 degree global average warming, even with the new NDCs that were shared and put forward at COP26. And even if we look at the more elusive net zero goals, we are still heading for 1.9 to 2.1 degrees of average warming. So there is a heavy dependence on adaptation, and it will just be increasing in the future. But at the same time, I do feel quite optimistic. If you look carefully at the AGR findings that soon will be presented to us, and then the outcomes of COP26, there's something that I believe we can build on. So let's not despair quite yet, and take the little kind of progress that we've seen now in the last few weeks and make that into an optimistic thing. And then I would also like to thank the authors and UNEP DTU team, and then Denmark, Norway, and Sweden for financially supporting the production of the Adaptation Gap Report and playing a role in getting adaptation higher up on the agenda and strongly into the 2022 COP27. And Lars, with that small intro, I would like to give back to you and the team for giving us the details.
Thanks, Niklas. And before we get started on presenting the report's key findings, I will now make a very quick introduction to what the Adaptation Gap Report is and the outline and conceptual framing of the 2021 report. So UNEP has been producing Adaptation Gap Reports since 2014. This is the 6th edition. It was launched at COP26 in Glasgow in early November. And since the beginning, the primary objective of the Adaptation Gap Report series has been to assess global adaptation gaps and inform on the status and results of global adaptation efforts. Starting with the previous report in 2020, the Adaptation Gap Report is developed around a recurrent 3-part structure. That is that the same basic outline will be applied to all adaptation gap reports towards the first global stocktake in 2023. Part 1 is the core element in this recurring format and involves the assessment of 3 central elements of the adaptation process: planning, financing, and implementation, with 1 chapter dedicated to each, as indicated in this slide. Part 2 is a deep dive, which is a more detailed assessment of the same 3 elements for a selected theme or sector. In 2021, the selected theme is the emerging consequences of COVID-19 on adaptation planning and finance. The purpose of the deep dive is twofold. First, it provides a more detailed picture of progress in the selected theme or sector, or in the case of this year, the implications of a particular event on the 3 main levels of analysis. And second, it adds supplementary perspectives, nuance, and detail to the overall progress assessment in the report. The theme is selected from year to year in light of global developments and international priorities and needs of UNFCCC. And finally, part 3 synthesizes findings from parts 1 and 2 into a status of global adaptation progress and offers an outlook on future developments. This figure, which is taken from the report, summarizes the conceptual framing in the Adaptation Gap Report. The Adaptation Gap Report aims to assess global progress on adaptation, and progress in this report is understood at 2 distinct levels of analysis. First, progress can be considered in the context of outputs from the adaptation process, that is, the sum of activities engaged in to help achieve adaptation objectives. This basically corresponds to answering the question, what are we doing today to adapt to the impacts of climate change? While it is by no means a straightforward or trivial methodological exercise to answer this question, the data generally allows a relatively comprehensive picture of progress at the output level. However, assessment of adaptation outputs can only provide a preliminary part of the progress story. The big question, of course, is to what extent are we actually reducing climate risk levels today and in the future? Or to put it in a different way, is our progress on outputs actually translating to outcomes, and are those outcomes adequate considering the magnitude of impacts expected? And such outcomes can be further split in 2, as indicated in this figure: observed outcomes, that is the outcomes that we can observe already today, and expected outcomes, that is the outcomes that we are expecting from currently planned adaptation efforts in the future. Outcomes are unfortunately much more tricky to quantify with current methodologies, and assessment of outcomes in the Adaptation Gap Report are therefore, for the time being, only possible to a relatively limited extent and more qualitatively than what is possible for outputs. However, in the current report, we have made some progress on the assessment of outcomes through a qualitative framework of expert judgments, as will be explained in the presentation of the Outlook chapter a bit later here. We hope this will be further expanded in future adaptation gap reports to provide an increasingly strong methodological foundation for the assessment of outcomes. And finally, just before handing over to presentations of key findings from the report, let me again remind you that if you have any questions or comments for the presentations or for the panel that comes after that, you can ask these in writing using the interface found by the small question mark. You can do that at any time during the webinar, so just feel free to go ahead anytime you like. We will monitor these questions and try to include as many as we can in the Q&A session coming later in the agenda. But of course, as there's a lot of participants, we can't guarantee that all questions will be answered here, but we are of course happy to follow up bilaterally after the sessions if there are any burning questions that have not been answered. And with that short intro, let me hand over to Fatin Tawfik from the Adaptation Division at UNFCCC. Fatin was one of the lead authors of the planning chapter and will present the key findings on progress of adaptation planning. Over to you, Fatin.
Thanks, Lars, for that introduction. And I'll jump right into chapter 3, which looked at global progress on adaptation planning. So the main objective of the chapter this year was to update the analysis of global adaptation planning included in the 2020 Adaptation Gap Report using newly submitted documents, predominantly NDCs, to begin to get a sense of how the status and landscape of adaptation planning is evolving over time. So when I'm referring to progress, I'm referring to progress from that initial analysis last year. So we found that currently 79% of countries have at least one national level adaptation planning instrument in place. So that's a plan, strategy, policy, or law. This is up from 72% in the 2020 AGR, and an additional 9% of countries who do not have such instruments in place are currently developing one. So if we look back to the year 2000, which is when the first instrument found in our analysis was established, it's clear that the pace and the scale of adaptation planning around the world has accelerated considerably. So in addition to the growth in planning instruments overall, almost half of countries with one national adaptation planning instrument in place have developed at least one more national level instrument, and some have even more than that. In some cases, these sets of instruments within a country complement one another. In other cases, they replace one another, and this may reflect early signs of progress in iterative adaptation planning. So, of course, the challenge is not only to gauge the quantity of adaptation planning instruments, but also ultimately their adequacy and their effectiveness. There's no direct, universally accepted way to do this. So our chapter does it indirectly by looking at various criteria and associated indicators. So the first criteria we looked at was comprehensiveness, which assesses the extent to which countries' identified adaptation options match their identified priority sectors. And we found that for 2/3 of countries, there is a match, and this is a 15% increase over the 2020 report, and a further 23% of countries have measures that at least partially match. The next criteria was inclusiveness, which has two dimensions. First is stakeholder engagement, and we found that 70% of countries developed their adaptation plans through consultations with stakeholders, a 22% increase over 2020. The second dimension is gender, and we found that 73% of countries are incorporating gender considerations, which is a significant increase of 40% over the 2020 analysis. Next, to assess implementability, one indicator the chapter measures is the presence of a central administrative body to oversee adaptation policymaking and implementation. So in 2021, we found that 43% of countries report having put one of these bodies in place, as compared with 35% in the 2020 Adaptation Gap Report. We also looked at the presence of policy instruments, and these include regulations, investments, and incentives for adaptation. And these also saw a notable increase. 71% have at least one policy instrument for adaptation in place, as compared with 48% in the 2020 Adaptation Gap Report. Next, we looked at integration or mainstreaming and found that vertical integration lags behind horizontal integration. So 75% of countries have a horizontal coordination mechanism in place, which is an 11% increase over 2020 versus 32% with vertical coordination mechanisms, although that does represent a bigger increase of 22% since the previous analysis. Similarly, almost 2/3 of countries have a standalone sectoral plan in place, furthering their horizontal integration, compared with just around 1/4 with subnational adaptation plans in place. And finally, around 1/4 of countries have dedicated monitoring and evaluation systems in place, with another 36% in the process of developing M&E systems. Unfortunately, we can't do a direct comparison with the 2020 Adaptation Gap Report because we changed slightly the way the metric is assessed. But either way, it's clear that this is one of the areas where further work is needed. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Lars. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fatin. And I now pass the floor to Paul Watkis from Paul Watkis Associates. Paul was one of the lead authors of the finance chapter and will present its key findings. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Lars. Yep, so what we do in Chapter 4 is we look at the costs of adaptation as how much we need, and then we look at the adaptation finance flows, which is what we've got, and the difference between the two is the adaptation finance gap. So starting with the cost of adaptation, obviously the costs depend on how we're doing with respect to meeting Paris or not, but it also depends a little bit on how you set the objectives for adaptation and issues around uncertainty or adaptation deficits and what you count. But in the AGR, our estimates of the cost of adaptation reported in previous years is 140 to 300 billion US dollars by 2030 in terms of adaptation costs for developing countries, and broadly doubling by mid-century. So what we've done this year, and I think this is where we start to get some interesting findings, is that when we look at the literature, a sort of rapid stocktake indicates that the impacts and economic costs of climate change itself are rising. If we look at the evidence base, we see some more negative science, more consideration of extreme events and various impacts that push us towards higher impacts, and in turn that leads to higher costs of adaptation. So if we compare, say, estimates of coastal adaptation globally that we had from 5 or 6 years ago and compare them to now, we're seeing updated and higher numbers. So that suggests we're probably towards the upper end of that range. Of course, in the short term, we can do lots of cost-effective, low and no-regret adaptation, but on its own, that's not going to be sufficient. And particularly, I think it's always worth highlighting that we get some great benefits from mitigation, but those tend to happen and occur after 2040. So the next 20 years are mostly locked in, and that's where you really need this scale-up of adaptation, even with ambitious mitigation scenarios. The other thing we've got that's been really interesting this year is we've had the new NDC submissions, and so we're able to look at NDC submissions and NAPs that are out there. And very interestingly, we can compare a country that maybe submitted a cost of adaptation in its NDC in 2015-16 and see how those numbers are changing over time. And again, we see this sort of shift upwards. That tends to be because countries are often counting more sectors, and you can see the sectoral split of the adaptation finance needs from NDCs in the figure. And what we find is about 58, not all, but 58 developing countries have submitted cost estimates either in their NAPs or NDCs. We can add those up, and then we can sort of extrapolate globally, and that comes to a value, again, of around 250 billion per year by 2030. These NDCs don't use consistent or always kind of harmonious approaches, so it's very difficult to add them up. We have to be a little bit careful because they are estimates of needs rather than explicitly costs, but they do add a lot of weight to our thinking that adaptation cost stroke needs are going up. We can then compare that to adaptation finance flows, and this always surprises people, but actually tracking those finance flows is surprisingly difficult and challenging. We still have lots of gaps, particularly around domestic and private sector adaptation flows. But what we do and what we can say in terms of known funding, if we take all countries, and this obviously includes developed and developing, the latest figures from CPI are a number of around 632 billion for the period of the last couple of years. Now that's a really big number, and that has changed dramatically over time. But a large proportion of that is also private sector, which is really interesting. But only a very small proportion, around 45 billion, is adaptation. And if we dive down to developing countries, we get a smaller number still. And as I'm sure many of you will have seen, in terms of the Copenhagen pledges of 100 billion of total climate financing a year by 2020, we don't believe that target was met. The latest sort of stock take is around 80 billion, of which around 20 billion was adaptation. And whilst you can see some very positive messages, you can see at the bottom, adaptation finance flows from bilateral and multilateral sources are increasing. We still have much lower flows compared to the sorts of numbers we have on the adaptation cost side. So just to conclude on the sort of finance chapter, taking a step back and taking into account all the caveats, adaptation costs, we think, are looking like they are 5 to 10 times greater, even in the short term, than the known public adaptation finance flows. What's also really interesting is that the gap appears to be getting larger. And that's because the evidence suggests that adaptation costs and needs continue to go up, whilst at the same time adaptation finance flows are staying broadly stable. There's a little bit of uncertainty where they go next because of the combination of COVID versus pledges at Glasgow, but there, in terms of the broad order of magnitude, there is this very big difference. How do we fill the gap? Well, we certainly can incentivize private sector and domestic adaptation financing, and there has been a lot more interest and promising innovation in those areas, but they're unlikely to finance and fill and bridge that gap. And I think the other thing we always note is that private sector finance, whilst essential, is going to be very sort of choosy on where it actually decides to invest. It will go clearly where there's the highest revenues, and that's likely to generate some issues around the most vulnerable and about making sure that we reach all of the needs that we have for adaptation. And finally, just to highlight, Very positive announcements in Glasgow. Seems to be a sort of recognition of these issues, although not quite clear yet how those will translate through into actual firm financing flows. But what we do need urgently is still a scale up of international public adaptation finance, both for directly investing in public adaptation and supporting developing countries, but also as a means of overcoming the barriers to private sector adaptation. And with that, I'll close on the adaptation finance chapter, Lars, and hand back to you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. And I'll hand it onwards to Timo Leiter, who is from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Timo was the lead author on the implementation chapter of the report and will present its findings. Over to you, Timo.
Thank you very much, Lars. And yeah, happy to present the findings from the implementation chapter of the report. So in addition to all the information we have just heard on finance and planning, an important question is what is being done with all these financial resources and what results do they lead to? And this is what this chapter is looking at. So, for example, we are looking at where adaptation is taking place, what forms it takes, against which hazards it is aimed, who is adapting, and we are trying to look at available data on what the effects are of these investments. So overall, trying to assess the outputs and outcomes on adaptation. The scope of the chapter is global, with a particular focus on developing countries. If you're interested in more comprehensive details on particular geographic regions or sectors, the IPCC's next Working Group 2 report coming out in February will include more details. So what did we base this chapter on implementation on? Since this is a global report, we need global data sources, and we are using 3 data sources in this year's chapter, one more than last year. So first, we're looking at project documents from the 3 UNEP funds, the Adaptation Fund, the GCF, and the Global Environment Facility. So we're looking at the principal adaptation projects they have. Secondly, we look at the top 10 bilateral donors on adaptation, which together account for 90% of the adaptation funds under the OECD system for the last 10 years. And as a third source, we're looking at journal articles which document adaptation. And this has just been published as a separate article as well. These 3 data sources are complementary with little overlap, and they provide a multi-year coverage that we can look at. So while this is incomplete, it gives us a good indication of adaptation globally. I now have one slide for each of these data sources. The first one is from the 3 UNEP climate funds. We have found overall 436 principal adaptation projects. So we're only looking in the chapter at projects that primarily address adaptation. And this number is a 10% increase compared to the last Adaptation Gap Report, despite the pandemic. And what we do clearly see here in this diagram is a trend to larger projects. And this means that potentially systematic vulnerabilities or climate risks could be more comprehensively addressed. Looking at the findings from the second data source, the top 10 bilateral funders, we have found more than 2,600 projects, which underscores the significance of bilateral adaptation support in addition to multilateral adaptation support. And what you can also see here in this diagram is that over the last 5 years, there have been twice as many projects in total than in the 5 years prior to the Paris Agreement. And the dip in 2018 was largely caused by the former US administration. We also found an over-reporting of principal adaptation, which means that approximately 1/3 of all the projects that the OECD database includes and which are labeled as principal adaptation are actually not primarily on adaptation. There are also 2 maps in the chapter on where all these projects are located. And whilst we don't have much time now to go through this, keep in mind that both of the maps just record the number of projects irrespective of their funding size. and irrespective of the population size of the countries. And in the report, you can compare where the bilateral projects are located to the locations of adaptation found in the literature. And the final slide. So another very important aspect was to look at, okay, what evidence do we have of the outcomes of adaptation? So the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative looked at 1,700 journal articles which document adaptation, and only 2% of them contain evidence of risk reduction, either quantitative or qualitative evidence. While this doesn't mean that the other 98% did not have an effect, it just means we have very little data to prove that. So that remains a bottleneck. And same for the global climate funds, which often use output indicators rather than outcome indicators. And that is still a bottleneck, as we don't have a lot of data around this. So we need to improve that, but more importantly, we need to improve adaptation programming from the start to make sure that projects have a high likelihood of achieving risk reduction. And these are our four ways forward. That was the first. Second one is using theories of change to outline how the intervention is supposed to lead to adaptation, and also keeping in mind higher end climate impacts, not just planning for today's climate variability, and learning from evaluations. That was a very short overview of the many findings we have in the chapter. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Timo. And with no further ado, I'll invite Nanak Narula from Oxford University. Nanak was a contributing author on the report's deep dive chapter looking at the emerging consequences of COVID-19 on adaptation planning and finance. You look to be ready. Nanak, please go ahead.
Terrific. So before I launch into this particular slide, an overview of Chapter 6 is that we were focusing specifically on what have been the impacts of COVID-19 on adaptation planning and financing. Obviously, this is a very large topic, and so we've tried to focus it in specifically on how COVID-19 has affected the adaptive capacity of particularly states. So focusing on governments, but of course noting that adaptive capacity as a concept involves more than just governments, also includes subnational actors and societies writ large. So we have, I think there'll be four main themes that I'll talk about today. And this first one is a finding for adaptation planning. So specifically, what we found looking through the literature is that climate change and COVID-19 in their own rights have a number of similarities. That is, they unfold over long periods of time, and the implications only become clear as you progress through time. They also exacerbate pre-existing vulnerabilities. So we saw in COVID-19 that there's inequity both in who is affected by COVID, both in terms of public health impacts, as well as the subsequent economic impacts, as well as who can respond to them. And again, this is similar to climate change. But more importantly, what the literature was really identifying is the way that these different risks and these different shocks actually interact, the way they amplify each other's effects, and that the way they interact with systems, whether they are social, environmental, or economic. And this insight around compounding shocks and compounding risks is a key one for climate change adaptation planning going forward. I think one example which we brought out in the chapter was around earlier in the pandemic in April 2020 when Cyclone Harold swept through the Pacific. It was a Category 5 cyclone. What we saw there was that Fiji's response to COVID-19 impacted its response to Cyclone Harold, specifically disaster centres, which ordinarily are used as the frontline defence, also had to adhere to COVID-19 protocols, impeding the efficacy of the way they were able to respond to natural disasters. We also looked at, as much as possible, what have been the concrete impacts on adaptation planning and disaster risk financing and adaptation financing broadly due to COVID-19. As COVID-19 is still evolving and the literature is also catching up, this was largely based on practitioner testimonies and qualitative analyses. But some of the things which have come out in particular around planning are some stalled or delayed NAP processes. So in particular, the NAP Global Network, which supports governments to develop their own NAPs, found that COVID-19 resulted in cancelled meetings and consultations due to COVID restrictions, as well as diverted political support. But I think, as you heard from Fatine earlier on, there's still been remarkable progress in terms of NAP developments in spite of COVID-19. Secondly, the literature also found that some contingent disaster risk financing had been redirected to COVID-19. Now, this really demonstrates both a strength as well as a potential risk to be aware of. The strength is showing that contingent financing for disasters applicable in terms of providing greater support for climate change adaptation could be a key support and a key financial strength in the initial stages of COVID-19 response. The risk element is that some of these facilities may have been depleted in the short term, and so this is an area to monitor and keep abreast of as we progress. Now, a large focus of the chapter was on adaptation financing. What have been the impacts from COVID-19? The largest message we found was, I think, a resounding call that this is an opportunity for investment in green and resilient recoveries. So there's quite a large literature which says investment in certain solutions that build resilience and which build adaptive capacity can also support economies, whether that's nature-based solutions such as coastal habitat restoration and protection of forests and wetlands, which can produce jobs and provide immediate economic benefits and social inclusion benefits while reducing climate risk and vulnerability. The quantitative literature on this is somewhat nascent, although there are a number of trackers of stimulus from COVID-19. These have not yet disaggregated adaptation financing separate from other climate financing. So the main paper which we drew on for the report looked at the textual references to green and resilient recoveries across stimulus that has been deployed. And so in total, this is about $17 trillion USDs of stimulus that has been deployed. And what the report found was that around 1/3 of sample countries had explicitly referenced climate risk in their packages, in their stimulus packages. Big caveats here are that this was last updated in January and also extended to looking at 72 countries, so is by no means robust to cover the whole globe. And another important point is that the capacity to invest in green and resilient recoveries is one that is different depending on the country that you look at. In particular, LDCs or emerging and developing economies may have existing vulnerabilities which have been exacerbated by COVID-19, which may reduce their capacity to invest in climate change adaptation funding going forward. In particular, existing debt distress is something which has a great capacity or potential to impede their fiscal space, and then as a result, their ability to invest in climate change adaptation funding. So even before the COVID-19 crisis, debt vulnerabilities were elevated in many of these countries. More than 50% of least developed countries were classified as either in or at high risk of debt distress. Falling revenues from COVID-19, as well as rising public debt due to stimulus and public spending, may have posed or at least created additional challenges to be taken into account. So what does all this actually mean for what can be done going forward? In the chapter, we put forward a number of suggestions or lessons for adaptation planning and financing. I won't go through them all now, but a couple to draw out are, in terms of adaptation planning, creating a greater emphasis on integrated risk management approaches to manage compound risks. So that is setting up facilities such as national risk boards, for example, that can facilitate coordination across critical risks rather than treating them as individual silos. In terms of the financing side, the overall recommendation is to increase investment in adaptive capacity to build forward better in a way that is resilient, inclusive, and also facilitates economic recovery. But of course, noting the point around potential debt distress of some countries, having greater support for developing economies through direct grants, debt forgiveness, or concessional finance. And I think Paul touched on private sector finance as one component of this with some limitations. What we have on the screen is an image depicting one novel potential debt for climate swap, which could combine debt relief with also greater investment in climate change adaptation as one potential way to kind of reconcile these competing demands. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Nanak. And finally, I hand the floor over to Alexander Magnan from IDRI. Alexander was a lead author on the framing chapters of the report and will be presenting a summary of some of the key overarching findings in the 2021 report. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Lars and colleagues. Yeah, so the final chapter is, of course, supposed to propose a synthesis of the main points raised in the previous chapters. So you understand with the previous presentation that there is a lot of material from the other chapters. So we try to organize to establish an analytical grid made of 12 rather qualitative criteria to summarize and to collect the information in the different chapters and organize this material around 3 points: progress made in terms of adaptation, the adaptation gaps, and also a cluster on the factors that constrain the interpretation of the results. In terms of the criteria, I won't go into the detail. You have them detailed in chapter 2 of the report and also in chapter 7, so you can go there. But they relate to the extent to which policy documents provide clear guidance on how to implement adaptation on the ground, whether we have or not adaptation goals clarified, whether equity and justice issues, for example, are considered, and so on. So there is a set of parameters. You see on the left, well, no, you can't see because it's too small, but this is the synthesis figure we have in chapter 7. It is on page 67 of the report, and you have, especially at the bottom, the set of criteria I was just talking about. And so the main conclusions across the chapters are the following. In terms of progress, we reinforce the conclusion we made last year that progress is clearly being made. For example, there is an increasing recognition of the importance of adaptation. Fatin talked about the way adaptation is now fully included in national planning. There is better integration in national level policy landscape and more actionable or dedicated policy instruments dedicated to adaptation, and that's an encouraging sign to see that there are more and more standalone sectoral planning instruments in place, for example. And Paul talked about that also. There are early signs of future progress, for example, more climate resilient and sustainable financial systems and investments are seen on the ground, and that's again something that is encouraging. But beside that, we also have some gaps. Several of them, but for example here, Paul talked about that, the adaptation finance doesn't seem to be at scale. The low rate of monitoring and evaluation systems remains a concern. Just to remind that these systems, these instruments are critical to help adjusting adaptation objectives, strategies, and resources over time. And this is one of the core objectives of adaptation, to be flexible and adjustable over time. We also see that there is limited knock-on effects from national to local strategies. So that means that it's unclear whether the planning processes in various countries at the national level lead to actual implementation, both at the national level but also at the more local levels. Timo talked about that. We still have very limited evidence on actual risk reduction, so it's hard to make the connection with policy level efforts and move further on this attribution issue. What we are doing concretely in terms of policy or action, does it really help reducing risk? This is still an important question we have difficulties to answer. And also the last point on equity issues, and especially we looked at gender in the different chapters. These equity issues are still under considered in the policy document. And at the same time, we know that they are critical to help things like adaptive capacity and reduce vulnerability. Besides progress and gaps, there are a series of factors that constrain the interpretation of the results, and this is one of the most important difficulty with adaptation. We have some factors that are well known. The lack of clarity in adaptation goals, the limitations in the availability of information, for example, data availability and so on. Also, these gaps or difficulties in understanding current and future risk levels. So there are things that we well know, and there are some works on that to try to move forward, but there are also newcomers, and especially, of course, referring to NANAC points, the COVID-19 crisis. And NANAC well said that and well reminded that the COVID-19 crisis both imposes barriers in terms of, for example, the finance public flows and so on, but also highlights some opportunities. And it's hard to make a balance and to find the right balance between these barriers and opportunities. The next slide, please, and I think that's the last one. Yes, we also, beyond trying to synthesize documenting material, we also tried, and this is a new thing compared to last year, in this year report, we try to start implementing a forward-looking approach. So based on the assessment criteria I showed you previously, and we applied on this criteria a kind of expert judgment by the authors of the report to try to complement the limited set of information we have about the future. So at this stage, I don't present the results because this is only partial conclusions, but we are now confident that this kind of approach could be continued in the next reports and could provide important insights to help national systems to have a more forward-looking understanding of what is needed now, and then enhance the level of transformation required to address future climate risk. And a very last point, we also have a last section in chapter 7, trying to take stock of where we are in terms of methods to assess adaptation progress, in terms of implementation, finance, and planning, and what do we know in terms of actual risk reduction, a point raised by Timo. And the conclusion here is that a lot of approaches exist, that there is some combinations to find, because no one of them is the silver bullet solution, and the combination of these different approaches is critical to move ahead in terms of knowledge on adaptation progress at the global level. And we see that there are new approaches that are emerging and that really try to do this combination of multiple sources of information. So this is a very encouraging sign, and we hope this will continue in the next years and decades. Okay, I think I can stop here, Lars, and give you the floor.
Many thanks, Alex. And this concludes our very quick run-through of the findings from the reports. I hope this has piqued your interest, and we would, of course, very much encourage you to pick up the full report, which has much more detail than we're able to cover in this short session, and it can be found on UNEP's website. We now proceed to a short panel discussion, and here I will hand over to my colleague Henry Neufeld, who is the head of the Impact Assessment and Adaptation Analysis section here at UNEP DTU Partnership, and a co-lead author and chief editor of this year's report as well. Henry will moderate the panel discussion and the following Q&A session. So over to you, Henry.
Thank you. So yes, I've been involved in the Adaptation Gap Report as the chief editor, and I'm really pleased to have a brilliant lineup of panelists whom we have asked to join us and provide some insights on their reading of the report. First we have Minpeng Cheng from the Renmin University of China. She's also a member of the Adaptation Gap Report Steering Committee and a member of the World Adaptation Science Program, WASP. Yes, that's first. Then secondly, we have Chris Gordon, who's also a member of WASP and based at the University of Ghana. Welcome, Chris. Thirdly, Maria del Pilar Bueno, who's a member of the Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas based in Argentina, and I can't see her on the screen yet. Maria Pilar, I hope that you are with us. Our fourth member of the panel is Cecilia da Silva Bernardo, who's also, she's from Angola and represents the LDCs on the Adaptation Committee. And then we have Coco Warner, who's with the UNFCCC, and unfortunately, I don't have your exact title in front of me, Coco. So apologies. Maybe you can just say who you are when it's your turn. I apologize for that. So let me just go quickly to a number of questions to each of you, or one question to each of you because of the limitation of time we have. And, it's, of course, all of these responses are in your personal capacity. You are not representing any organization here in particular. That said, Minpeng, to start with you, from a regional perspective, what's your take on the Adaptation Gap Report with regard to Asia in particular and the Pacific? Minpeng.
Hi, everyone. First, this is a very good question, actually. First of all, I think this is a very excellent report, and it provides a lot of valuable data and update on adaptation planning, implementation, and finance. And also, I like the COVID-19 deep dive chapter, which is very, very informative and inspiring. And it provides new perspective for the pandemic and climate change, as well as green recovery and adaptation. There is still a lot of information that deserves more time to digest. And due to the time limit, I would like to highlight 3 points, which I think that will be most important for Asia and the Pacific. The first one is COVID-19 will exert profound and comprehensive impact on adaptation. A green recovery should align short-term goal of recovery with our long-term sustainability and climate ambition, particular adaptation, so that we can enhance the resilience of economies and societies. As COVID-19 has brought about profound impacts on the economy, the full extent of which actually are still playing out. So according to IMF, Asia's economic growth is projected to come to a standstill in 2020. And the worst performance, which in almost 60 years. So in this context, a lot of countries began to adopt massive stimulus packages to get the economy moving again. This provides a unique opportunity to get them towards a green recovery. But the synergies between economic recovery, mitigation, adaptation can be further enhanced so that we can maximize stimulus effects both in the short and the long term. That's the first point I would like to deliver. The second is the importance of multi-stakeholders engagement for adaptation planning and implementation. When we are facing with challenging global issues, including COVID-19 and climate change, and no country can tackle them alone, so multilateral efforts are very essential. And enhanced international cooperation, particularly the support from developed countries for developing countries, is perhaps the only one out. As shown in the report, the bilateral and multilateral adaptation finance flow are very, very important for the world. At the same time, it's also become very clear that the government alone cannot address adaptation efficiently. There are still huge gaps, particularly for adaptation finance. So we need the business, civil society, and the people to join on the efforts. And we need to bring together commitment of all stakeholders at the very beginning of the development of adaptation planning. More important, and how to provide incentives for private sector domestic adaptation finance will also be very important. The third, a very quick point that I would like to share is it is very important to develop practical metrics and guidance. Not only for publication, actually, to check the adaptation progress and to evaluate the effectiveness of adaptation. Maybe that will be the foundation for create the incentives for private sector and to provide the incentives to mobilize more finance. I will stop here. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Min Peng. I think that's a really impressive response, and I think it goes way beyond also the regional perspective. So I'm hoping that, Chris, you can answer the same question ultimately from sort of an African perspective. What is your take on the Adaptation Gap Report, primarily from the African perspective?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I would join Min Peng in saying that the report is comprehensive, and what it has actually done is it has exposed the fact that adaptation in Africa is patchy, disconnected, not ambitious enough, and lacks implementation. Now, I'm saying these in the context of the IPCC Working Group 1 AR6 report, where it stated that Africa and its people will bear the brunt of climate change, including issues such as increase in wet extremes, high temperatures, and its consequent impact on agriculture, water, environment, and health. And the fact that that impact can result in the loss of the development gains made in the past decade. Now, COVID has shown us that when it comes to issues of global crisis, Africa is always the loser. So in order to change this, Africa needs to change its narrative. It needs to find its own place and take charge of the adaptation narrative and forget this issue of development versus adaptation versus mitigation debate. It's not productive for Africa. We have to change the current adaptation narrative to one that is pro-poor, nature-based, and rooted in community needs. Because of the time, I'll focus just on 4 points. The first is we need to increase climate literacy in Africa, and the strongest predictor of climate literacy is education. So we need to educate our population. The second is that, as mentioned before, there has to be a focus on climate literacy on targeting the socially disadvantaged and gender issues. The third is that there is an advantage of the low rate of climate literacy because it is an opportunity to preempt disinformation as has happened in some other developed countries. The second main point is that we need to build capacity in Africa to have an African voice in global assessments on adaptation. So we need to have funding options and opportunities to raise the abilities of African scientists. We also need to develop a holistic climate response, which goes beyond political and geographic and sectoral boundaries. And because of time, I will just end up by the need, which the GAP report has shown, that we need to scale up adaptation actions for Africa. Now is the time to mainstream, scale up, and accelerate support for climate change adaptation. And we have to have a more positive approach and reduce the doom and gloom scenarios for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think that was a great summary of a lot of the issues, of course, primarily pertinent for Africa, but also for many other developing countries or poor countries. And I think, focusing on pro-poor, nature-based, and socially just is really a great way to frame things. Thank you so much. Maria, the same question to you, and I have no doubt that what we've heard so far, the response is going to be quite different as they've tended to be so far. So Maria, what's your regional perspective on the report?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I would like to add my voice to the colleagues previously by saying this is indeed a very insightful and comprehensive report. So really, congratulations. From my regional perspective, that is Latin American and the Caribbean region, I think that there is clear evidence coming from the science that our region is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And this is also indicated in many indexes that we can cite, of course, but almost all countries comply with 7 to 8 of the 9 points included in Article 4.8 of the UNFCCC of the Convention. So, I mean, we could take this from different perspectives. In terms of planning, one of the main axes of this report, almost all Latin American countries already have at least one instrument. I would like to add to this that 11 countries of the region, that is 1/3 of the region, submitted NAPs to the NAP Central of the UNFCCC, as well as 7 countries submitted adaptation communications according to the Paris Agreement. And some of them were really early movers in terms of this document. At the same time, and however, the development of monitoring and evaluation system, as this is a weak point globally, this is signaled in the document per se, it is also a challenge regionally. M&E systems are still not seen as part of the adaptation planning process, but they are mostly considered as later activities for countries to take. And this is it not only have deep consequences in terms of our planning implementation and, of course, many processes inside, but also this has a projection outside. This means that this will impact, of course, the measure of the GGA, of the Global Goal on Adaptation, and the collective progress of adaptation under the GST. So considering the Adaptation Gap Report methodology, there is, of course, a strong relationship between implementation and finance. From the report, we know that there is a high concentration of bilateral projects in the north part of South America, leaving other parts of the region behind. And this is also supported by the information in journal articles. Maybe one of the most concerning messages of the report for my region is that not only adaptation implementation is unevenly distributed, but it's also a question if it's really taking place. So it's very important, and this will be my last comments, to say that a clear relationship should be made between these issues in terms of implementation and access to finance and finance per se, with the structural challenges that affects my region. That means inequality, recurring economic crises, extractivism, and the impact of debt services, all of them exacerbated by COVID-19. So it's really essential to reconsider transitional financial flows from an equitable geographical perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. I think that was really an interesting additional component that we haven't heard about before. You know, the monitoring and evaluation element, which is a big problem. We've heard that. And also the integration of adaptation into structural development and progress in more general terms. So thank you for that. My next question then to you, Coco. I have a question, and which is a bit different. And I might have a second question for you, because you also somehow represent, you know, you could say something about the developed countries and how prepared they are to the impacts of climate change. You know, we've heard a lot about Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We haven't heard anything about the rest of the world, you know, the developed countries or advanced economies, which have also experienced a lot of climate impacts recently. So that's one question, how prepared are countries in the developed world to the current and expected future climate changes? And then I think also connected to that question is, how will that future climate change impact loss and damages under the Paris Agreement? And what is your expectation of how COP26 will affect the nationally determined contributions and adaptation in general? So that's a complex question, and I'll give you a little bit more time. Yes?
Great. It's such a pleasure to be here. Congratulations to all of the colleagues who pulled together this report. I've been seeing it in the media. It's a wonderful reference. Like Chris and so many others said, it really contains so much information. It's valuable. And it's also a privilege to be with all of you as panelists and also the last panel. Indeed, I think all of us are deeply concerned, whether we're IPCC lead authors, or as myself, by the way, I'm Coco Warner. I'm a manager in the adaptation division at UNFCCC. So in my day job, I'm with the Secretariat. If you're citizens living in towns or the countryside all over the world, I think it's deeply concerning what people are already experiencing. I just made a couple of notes here. So all over the world, this is just referring to last year, people are feeling the adverse impacts that have a climate change signal: unexpectedly harsh winter storms, cyclones, severe drought and locust swarms that destroy crops, life-threatening heat domes at a huge scale, half a continent just last summer, progressive sea level rise that threatened coastal communities. I could go on. All of you are the experts in that. Climate change knows no boundaries. And that is so concerning for all of our countries and all of our communities. So maybe there's just so much to talk about. So let me get to the second and third part of your question, Henry. The UNFCCC understands these questions. And at COP26 in Glasgow, which ended just what are we? Pilar, are we 10 days away? I forget, but it seems like it was just yesterday. It almost was. So UNFCCC convened world leaders, thousands of delegates, almost tens of thousands of additional people who come and bring their expertise and are part of that important moment. So world leaders came, and on the upside, they announced efforts to restore forests and other ecosystems. I'm just reading some notes here. To harness renewable energy, transform and shape a prosperous, safe future through clean and green energy. Country representatives talked about rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time scaling up adaptation. So at one level, how wonderful. and in some ways concrete. You heard words like my mom is talking about methane. My mother, she didn't know what methane was very long ago. And so I think in terms of awareness of many of us, it's getting better, and that's really important. But of course, we have to do the hard work of getting to action. Now, if there are all kinds of estimates about what all of the sum of those commitments might add up to, some optimistic estimates are 1.8 degrees Celsius, and that sounds better than the 2.7 that I think your report took into the COP26. But of course, pardon me, I'm like using my regional phraseology, but the proof is in the pudding. Sorry, Thanksgiving is in 2 days. So what's really going to matter is what actually unfolds over this decade. So now let me talk about 3 really important groups of outcomes from COP26. So many of you on this call actually put in the long hours in the middle of the night to help craft this language. And I think we're all part of the disappointment and part of the success of COP26. But it's just this grindy, difficult process of moving forward together. So what are 3 things that I wanted to highlight? First, NDCs. Second, global goal on adaptation. And third, a dialogue on loss and damage. So I'll go most in depth in the NDCs because I think I might be running out of time. And then just a couple of notes about those others. So next year, 2022, put on your seatbelt because there is so much work to do on NDCs. There's a role for every person on this call to help your national representatives articulate NDCs. So let me just name a couple of these. And again, I'm just looking at bullet points that I wrote down. If you want, by the way, in the chat, I put the web page where you can go to find all of the relevant decisions. It's a bit dry to read, but I really encourage you to do your homework and read the decisions, because everything that happens now, at least in our process, that's where it starts. So for the NDCs, parties decided to establish a work program to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation. The SBI and the SBSTA jointly will come up with a draft recommendation for CMA4. CMA4, that's going to be a COP27 in Egypt. So really, really important. Watch for that draft decision. This is going to complement the global stocktake. Parties agreed to update their NDCs before Egypt. And there are 2 things that I wanted to mention there. Parties have been requested to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets in their NDCs to align with the Paris Agreement's Article 2, which contains the temperature goal. It also contains that recognition about adaptation and resilience and finance. There's also a point on NDCs about long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. And that includes just transitions to net zero emissions by around mid-century. This is all work happening next year. That's really substantial, and it's a big opportunity to help countries, to support them in articulating that ambition, and then even more importantly, making that happen. The Secretariat is going to annually update the synthesis report on NDCs. So every year there's going to be an NDC update, and it was so gratifying to see that your report drew on that. So that's going to be a wonderful collaborative kind of information activity every year for the next bit. And then there will be an annual high-level ministerial roundtable on pre-2030 ambition. So don't anybody think that NDCs will kind of fall away and be forgotten. There's a lot of emphasis on countries coming forward in the coming months. This is all going to be happening kind of quickly. Okay, I spent a lot of time on NDCs. Let me say 2 additional things, because this is about the adaptation gap. The COP in Decision 1 CP26 decided there will be a work program on the global goal on adaptation. So again, read the decision, find out about that. But this is it's an intellectual piece. It's understanding what countries need. And even beyond countries, the communities in those countries, it should be needs driven. And then that third bit is a dialogue on loss and damage. This will be articulated by the SBI chairwoman together with the WIM-EXCOM, that's the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee. So they'll work together and kind of articulate this dialogue on loss and damage. That will happen at the first SB session, that's June-ish next year. Or actually, I don't know if it will be in 2022. It depends on what the SBI chair says. But it will happen in every SB at June, the mid-year session, until 2024. So those are three really big things. Now there's a call to action to all of you, and I already said it. Please read the decisions. Please read them before Christmas or whenever you take a break. And why? Because there are so many opportunities for you to get involved, to write a submission. I know the UNFCCC website is a beast, but if you have problems with it, just write to me or write to somebody and we'll help you find the door. But your thoughts and your constructive ideas, I think they do make a difference. They are needed. And this is your chance. So please get involved, play a constructive role, because there are many opportunities for you just this coming year. And that's just 2022. We haven't even talked about the road ahead. And this is the last thing that I'll say, Henry. Sorry this has taken so long. But the last thing that I would say is a major contribution of the UNEP Gap reports is, of course, raising awareness. And it's so clear there is a gap. Even though we don't ultimately, this is a moving target, we have to work the rest of this century together. But what's going to be important, and we've seen this with COVID, is that we bring our communities along. We're talking about adaptation, and our communities are the ones that will enact adaptation. And so this is an opportunity, but also a big challenge that we don't leave people behind. I know, okay, I work for the UN, so of course I'm going to say that, but really to be successful with adaptation, we really have to bring people along, make sure they have the information that you've spent so much time putting together. So thank you so much. I'll stop.
Thank you, Coco. And I think it was really great for our audience to hear this call to action that you just articulated. And hopefully a lot of people will pick up that call and visit the website and check out how they can engage in the future. And for us with the Adaptation Gap Report, I think there's also opportunities to take the ongoing decisions and see how we can contribute to helping the UNFCCC by raising awareness and doing what we do normally. Thank you. Okay, so in view of the passing time, we have 15 minutes left. I think the questions now that I'm receiving from my colleagues, Lars and Aris, in my very small window, unfortunately, it's too small for me to read in full. I can't say exactly who the questions are meant to be for. So, and this is now for all of the panelists, and also, of course, in particular, the speakers who spoke about the chapters. Just to, raise your hand if you want to say something, and I'll just read the question, and we'll keep it short, please, in your response. So the question here: how do you distinguish adaptation costs from other, in brackets, sustainable development investment needs? Appears that funding, for example, into climate-proof infrastructure addresses both at times. Maybe this is a question specifically to Paul in first instance, but others might want to pull and pick up the question as well. Paul.
Thank you, Henry, and a nice, easy question to start with. Yeah, I mean, so this has always been an issue. I think there's lots of interrelated issues here about how you count and separate out development versus adaptation costs. And then there's also issues about the marginal cost of addressing climate change versus addressing the existing adaptation deficits that we have in all of our economies. So there are ways that we can do that. And I think this is where we actually see some differences in some of the estimates that come through. So in more scientific studies, we are actually able to sort of separate out and explicitly look at the adaptation cost over and above a future development pathway. Sometimes when we're reporting on other studies, there's a little bit of a mix-up and there's less separation there as well. But it is possible to do that by running a counterfactual and then redoing your analysis and looking at the additional climate change impact and then the additional climate change cost. But obviously, it isn't always easy. I think also this is something that we also find with respect to adaptation finance tracking, that quite often it can be difficult to separate out explicitly what's only or principally adaptation versus what's a secondary or a wider development goal. So there are established methods. There is a little bit of blurring around the edges, but it's definitely something we're getting better at. And one of the findings of that sort of analysis is we are seeing real additional cost needs that are developing and growing over time that we need to respond to.
Great, thank you, Paul, for that explanation. Does anybody else want to add something to that question? Oh, Chris, please, go ahead.
Well, I take a completely different view. I think this whole debate between adaptation and development is a total red herring, taking us away from the real issue, which is increasing resilience of populations. Now, if a population develops, its resilience increases. And trying to put adaptation as separate from development and vice versa, for me, is a non-starter. You cannot have adaptation without development, period. And I know this is a narrative that has been a result of countries that have developed trying to place development funding as climate funding, and countries that are least developed trying to get more funds out of the developed countries by trying to get them as separate. But it doesn't make any difference whatsoever once the populations are more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important point. I'm not disagreeing with either you or with Paul at this point. I don't know if there is actually a disagreement, but it's clear that there is a very strong connection between adaptation and development, and by increasing development, we're increasing resilience, and reducing climate risks is what we have to achieve with the adaptation that we're trying to do. So I have a question to Fatin, and what is the expected development regarding adaptation planning at national level, and how will COP26 affect the adaptation NDCs? Do you have any specific views in addition to what Coco was already saying?
Well, it's clear that adaptation planning each year is growing in significance, it's growing in attention, and it's like higher and higher on the political agenda, which is a very promising sign. I think the main development from COP26 is, as Coco was mentioning, this work program on the global goal on adaptation, because that was a clear recognition from parties that it's not only enough to have these fantastic plans, we also have to know where we stand when it comes to making progress towards goals both nationally and at the global level. So this is a 2-year work program that will hopefully clarify some of that, and that hopefully will inform adaptation planning and how it develops from now on, and also how we understand adaptation planning and where it's positioning us in relation to the global goal on adaptation as a global community, and hopefully taking us a little bit forward from this understanding of adaptation as a purely local thing, as something that we do need to understand locally beyond this patchwork of adaptation plans around the world. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And I think this is a really good segue into the question I have for Timo, building on the need to provide evidence of how the planning is playing out and how that leads to results on the ground. So how can adaptation action be increasingly mainstreamed to enhance ambition and scale up implementation?
Thank you. Yeah, So for mainstreaming, I mean, mainstreaming happens at multiple levels. One is, of course, at the national level through the National Adaptation Plan process, which, as the NAP progress report from UNEP shows, is increasing every year. But what's really important for mainstreaming is that it's not a separated exercise, that the adaptation planning isn't separate from the other sectoral planning or development planning, because then you don't achieve actual mainstreaming. I think that's maybe the main point to make on mainstreaming. And climate funds, if I can just add this from our chapter, it is really important that the projects make clear how they want to achieve adaptation. I've just looked at the findings from the 2019 evaluation report from the GCF, and it found that only 20% of its project had a well-defined theory of change. And this is of the approved projects. So you can really ask, how can projects get approved that don't make clear how they want to achieve risk reduction or any adaptation benefits? That's a major gap that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Great. I think that's a really important point you're making here, Timo. We need to have clear, we call it theories of change, of how is our planning going to implement, and we have to be open to assessing our thoughts on that in that regard to what we've achieved. So that's really important. Thanks. Alex, I have a question for you too, and that is, how can we better capture the progress in adaptation in the context of the global stocktake? I think this is a tricky question to answer because we don't have a clarity exactly on what the global stocktake is going to look at, but maybe you could add some thoughts on that.
Yeah, exactly. This is really the tricky question, and the one that is maybe one of the most important one in the years to come. I think we need three things. The first one is to clarify what are the goals for adaptation. I know there is this global goal on adaptation. I know there are some uncertainty and unclarity behind this goal, but we need collectively to disaggregate this global goal and have some more specific objectives. Otherwise, you cannot know what you are looking for. So it's difficult to track progress. The other point is that we need to strengthen the way national governments develop, track, present adaptation in their national communications, and try to find a way to have some commonalities between this work. And I think the decision from COP26 on this 2-year program is quite critical on that. So there is so much work on ahead. You're right, Coco. And the last thing is that maybe we also need to have some approaches that go beyond the national level and try to track adaptation progress, both locally but also globally, using different approaches, different ways of tracking things. But this mix of things, clarified objectives, national level approaches and non-national level approaches, I think the mix of all these things will help us have some clear answers in 2 years and more.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And I can only concur with you. There is still a lot of methodological work we have to do in order to get to that level where we can say something about the global goal on adaptation. And I think breaking it down into compartments we can deal with is a good way to start for sure. And the methodologies will have to be developing over time. So that's great. In view of the time, we have just 3 minutes left in our webinar, and I'm hoping that a lot of you are enjoying the participation, have learned something, and are curious to read the report itself, also to follow up on other questions at regional, national levels, and engage in climate change adaptation actions. Make sure that your politicians are doing the work that is needed to reduce climate risks. Let me try to just very briefly summarize what I think the core messages of the report are. And I think there are three. First point, in my view, is, we've all seen that climate change is happening and the impacts are growing across the world, all over the world. And in many places, we're not really prepared for these impacts. And that means that adaptation action is going to grow in order to reduce climate risks. And we know from the report that adaptation action really reduces climate risks, while it is not possible to eliminate these risks. So whatever we do, there is going to be growing climate risk because climate change is happening and it's growing. And therefore, mitigation, the avoidance of climate change, is so paramount for all of us. Second point, that we can see that there is adaptation progress. We've seen adaptation progress in planning, in finance, and in implementation. This is really across the globe, and it's very good that we can see that. But, and that's the caveat, there are gaps, and we need to raise the ambition in our adaptation actions, in the planning, in the finance made provisioned, and also to assess, how effective the actions are. And we need to scale up the implementation while figuring out better how they play out on the ground, how they reduce climate risk. And I think also in the last question regarding COVID is that we can learn a lot from the pandemic that we have seen, and that it provides us with a better understanding of how these international processes, this global pandemic, can increase our adaptive capacities, how we can build back better in a green and more resilient economy, but also, unfortunately, that those opportunities currently are still being missed. So I think these are the key points that I've wanted to make, and I apologize that I didn't have the time for another question on COVID, but I would like to hand it back to Lars and Aris now to close the session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henry, and nothing left for me to say other than thanks to everyone who attended. I really appreciate it, and hope you learned something, as Henry also said. So thank you a lot for that, and have a good evening, morning, day, wherever you are. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.